to this webinar, Worldviews on a Second Trump Presidency, Alliances, Adversaries and Opportunities. My name, for those of you I don't know, is Susi Dennison, and I'm a Senior Fellow at ECFR. So we're here today to talk about a new report that we've published based on a global survey of citizens, which took place in the weeks after the US elections at the end of 2024, asking about how they're thinking about the world that they live in, who they think calls the shots, and what that means for the countries that they live in. The report is called, if you've missed it in the media coverage today, the report is called Alone in a Trumpian World, the EU and Global Public Opinion After the US Elections. And we're very lucky to have all three of the report's authors with us today. They need no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. We have with us Timothy Garton, Professor of European Studies at the University of Oxford, Ivan Krastev, the Chairman of the Centre for Liberal Strategies, and Mark Leonard, the Founding Director of ECFR. So we're going to hear from all of them first, and I'm going to take the liberty of chairing this session to ask them a few questions. But you'll also be able to put your questions forward using the Q&A box, which you should be able to access at the bottom of your screen, towards the right-hand side if you look at the buttons there. But before we start off with the conversation, I'm going to ask Mark Leonard to take us through the key points from the data set on which the report is based. So Mark, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. And hopefully you can see the presentation. You can now see the presentation. And the sort of backdrop to this is that we're probably in the biggest crisis of transatlantic relations since the Suez Canal. We haven't even seen Donald Trump come to office yet, but he's already indicated that he wants to overturn almost every single aspect of the US-led order, trading, security alliances. And he's talked about potentially even using military force against Greenland. And his allies, particularly Elon Musk, has declared that he wants to overthrow the British government, maybe even the German government. But it's also kind of bizarre that people don't really know how to process it. And that's the sort of backdrop to the poll that we've done. We have spoken to almost 30,000 people in 24 countries, 16 European countries, 8 non-European countries. And what we found is that though there is a real psychodrama going on in many European countries about Donald Trump's return to the presidency, this is not something which is widely shared outside of Europe. In fact, it's only America's closest allies that seem to be having this deep foreboding. So I'm just going to talk you through some of the most striking findings, starting with this very, very striking sense that Donald Trump's return to the presidency is being welcomed in many different places. So we asked people whether they thought that the election of Donald Trump was good or bad thing for American citizens. And as you can see here, outside of Europe, large majorities of people thought that he was good for America, rising to 85% in India. We also asked them whether Trump's return to the White House was good or bad for their country. And again, there you can see that in India, 84% think that it's good for India, but majority in Saudi Arabia and pluralities in Russia, China, Brazil, and South Africa, Turkey, Indonesia. And it's really only in European countries that people think that it's bad for their country, apart from South Korea. But it's not just about the abstract idea of being good or bad for American citizens or for their countries. We also found that people really buy into the idea of Trump as a peacemaker. So very large number of people think that Trump is going to be good for peace in the world. And then we broke that down into specific crises. And you can see that on Ukraine, a lot of people in India, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, South Africa, and even in the US think that he is going to be a peacemaker in Ukraine. And you see a similar picture when it comes to the Middle East, where lots of people think that he'll be more likely to bring about peace in the Middle East as well as in Ukraine. In these different figures, you do see Europeans and South Koreans typically being more skeptical. But there are also divisions even in Europe. And what we found is that there's sort of 5 different ways of looking at Trump, which are split between different countries, but also within different countries. And this slide's quite interesting because it shows the distribution of these different tendencies in different places. The first camp is the kind of most straightforward. It's the blue camp, the people who are excited about Trump, who think that he's good for their country and good for the world. On the other side, you have the red camp, people who think that Trump is bad for their countries and bad for the world. But what's quite interesting are some of the groups in the middle. You have the group that we call the peace seekers, who think that Trump may not be good for their countries, but is likely to bring about peace in different areas. And then you have the conflicted, who think that Trump might be good for America, but not necessarily good for them. And that includes some of the ideological sympathizers who like what Trump stands for. And then there are a lot of people who are sort of uncertain, who have yet to decide where they line up. The second thing which we found very interesting is the reasons for people being pro-Trump and what they think about him. So we did find that a lot of people do think that the US is going to become more powerful and is more powerful as a country. But strikingly, they don't think that the US is going to be dominant. In most of the countries that we polled outside of Europe, people think that China is going to overtake the US to become the most powerful country in the world. So our analysis of why people think that Trump is so good for the world is that in many of these countries, the reason that people are excited about him is almost the opposite of the reasons why Europeans are, it's for the same reasons why Europeans are so uncomfortable about it, because the US is going to move from being a hegemonic power that saw itself as the leader of the free world, that was upholding the global system, to becoming a more normal power that will selfishly put its own interests first and advance those interests. And in a more transactional world, that is a more popular way of being American. And it's for that very reason that people in South Korea, in Ukraine, and in Europe are so uncomfortable about the US, because it seems to be, Trump's re-election seems to be about cutting itself off from that historical mission. What is also striking about the poll is that, which is in line with that, is that when it comes to the polling on Russia and Ukraine, and I know Tim's going to talk in greater detail on that, so I won't dwell on that, but the poll shows how much Western countries have struggled to isolate the Russians and to pin the blame on Russia for the war in Ukraine. And you can also see, and this is something that we've tracked for a long time, that the number of people thinking that Ukraine is going to win this war is very low around the world, and even in Ukraine now, it's a minority of people, which is a sort of big shift from what we saw in the first 2 iterations of our poll. So I'll end with just a very striking slide about Europe, a couple of slides about Europe. So we've been sort of thinking a lot about how Europe fits into this into this new world, and what we feel very strongly is that if you take the data seriously, it shows that Europeans cannot try to pose as the conscience of the world. When Donald Trump was elected first time round, there were lots of articles saying that Angela Merkel was now the true leader of the free world, and there was a famous picture which captured that position of her looming over Donald Trump at the G7. And we feel that there's very little appetite for Europeans to play that role, given how much Trump is being welcomed in different places. That being said, people by and large have got quite positive feelings about Europe. When we ask them whether Europe is an ally, a necessary partner, a rival, or an adversary, outside of Russia, nobody sees Europe as an adversary, or very few people do. And most people see it either as an ally and as a necessary partner. But we also found that when we ask people how strong Europe is, people, a majority of people in most places, or a plurality, think that the EU is a power that can deal on equal terms with other global powers like the US and China. The only place where people were very skeptical about that proposition were in Europe's biggest countries. But by and large, people outside of Europe think that Europe is stronger than most Europeans do. And those two findings give us some hope that Europeans can find their place in this transactional world if they work out what it is that they want to do, and if they find a way of talking to the rest of the world that's less about posing as a moral conscience and more about building alliances and making deals around issues of common interest in a much more transactional world. So I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Really powerful stuff. So I'd like to turn, if I can, next to you, Tim. It would be great to hear any other elements that you wanted to highlight, or in the data that you found particularly striking. But I would be particularly interested to hear from you. You wrote in your Guardian piece today, used the very striking framing of us, the moment we're living in, as being a world of wars. And I wondered if you could comment on what your takeaways are from working on this data set in terms of how people perceive Trump as a peacemaker in relation to Ukraine and the Middle East, and what we should draw from that.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. Well, first of all, it's been great working with Mark and Ivan and all the other wonderful colleagues at ECFR on this poll, which becomes more interesting every year we do it. So this is the third time we've done it, and then you see change over time, right? So autumn 2022, our conclusion, under the impact of the Ukraine war, was united West, divided from the rest. Autumn last year, we already discerned this a la carte world, this world of highly transactional great and middle powers, very happy to do business with everybody from issue to issue, by the way, including Russia. And one really striking thing in this poll, we're near the end of the third year of a brutal neo-colonial Russian war in Ukraine. Russia is an entirely acceptable partner to most of the world, even more acceptable slightly. And what is more, people in much of the world think Russia is actually going to be more influential in the years to come. So much for our complacent Western talk of a strategic defeat for Russia. So now what's happened is that, as Mark was saying, under Trump, for at least the next 4 years, the US is joining these transactional great powers. It's going to be just as transactional. So that leaves us and the South Koreans and a few others on our own. No more united West. For me, one of the most striking findings in this whole poll, we regularly ask the question of different countries and the EU, do you regard X or Y as ally, necessary partner, rival or adversary? Do you know how many Europeans, EU member states, an average of 9 EU member states, including France, Germany, Poland, Italy, and Spain, say they view the United States as an ally? 22%. 22%, right? Less than Chinese see Russians as an ally and Russians see China as an ally. That's a quite shocking fact. What kind of an alliance is it when less than a quarter of the people view the other as an ally? Interestingly, the number in the United States is double that and is actually holding up much better. But it's also, if you go under the hood, Susie, it's not just one Europe. I mean, we found significant differences between European countries in their responses, right? In particular, in our survey, 3 Southeast European countries, and the South is as important as the East, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania, were much more welcoming to Trump much more like the rest of the world, very different in their responses to Estonia or Poland or Denmark or Britain or France. Okay, so what do we have? Divided Europe, divided West, transactional world. Not a very rosy prospect. What do we do about it? I have two propositions, and then perhaps, Mark, we can come back to Ukraine a bit later if there's a specific question about it. Number one, I think we should ban all talk of the global south from all ECFR publications and all European speeches, right? Because what we see here is these countries regard themselves as individual great and middle powers with their own histories, their own cultures, their own national interests. So what we need is a targeted India policy, Turkey policy, Brazil policy, South Africa policy. What are the areas we can do business with them? Second conclusion, I think we need, as Europeans, to be less transactional at home, but I'm afraid more transactional abroad. So at the moment, European countries, EU member states or not, are becoming more and more transactional with each other, right? I mean, just look at Austria's new government and what its attitude is likely to be, not to mention Hungary or many others. It's all about the money, what's in it for us. But at the same time, the EU is still holding to the kind of rhetoric Mark was talking about in relation to the rest of the world. Whereas in this tough old Trumpian transactional world, where we're almost alone, and we're almost condemned to be more transactional. What do I mean by that? I mean, even while we go on deploring human rights abuses in China or India or wherever it might be, we have to find the areas where we can actually do business with them, right? Be it environment, be it energy, be it trade, be it digital, and then be prepared to do business with them and make our own kinds of deals with these transactional great powers in this Trumpian world we've identified. So those are my initial thoughts, and as I say, happy to come back on other points.
Great. Yeah, no, I'm sure there's lots to dig into in the conversation. So Ivan, I'm going to come to you now if I can. Like the others, you're also allowed to comment on whatever aspect you found particularly striking. But I wanted to particularly ask you about the fact that you have talked previously about us being in a moment where we're on the cusp of a new world order, but nobody wants to own it. Nobody wants to shape it. And yet we're talking about this now as a Trumpian world. So I wondered if I could ask you to sort of react to that in relation to this data set. Is this a project, this transactional environment, or is this about an understanding of the reality that the second Trump administration is coming into?
Thank you, Susi. So let's start with one kind of a big footnote. What we are measuring are moods. Keep in mind, moods can change fast. But what we are seeing, and in my view, this is why this opinion poll is so important, is that we are seeing a big change. So this is not that simply Trump is coming to office or he is changing. We see a kind of a change which is very much on the scale, probably not exactly of 1989, but something which is big. And I'm saying this because it is quite important, because before, when Trump came for the first time in 2016, there was still a reason to believe that this is certain aberration, that basically you can wait him out and the world is going to go back where it was. And in my view, this is not what we're seeing out of this survey. What we're seeing in the survey, we're getting into a new world, which means that every single player is going to change their identity. And I do believe Tim Garton has already referred to this, talking about Europe. First, about the United States. The major message of Trump is, we're not basically trying to remake the world. We're just trying basically to win as much as possible for it. From this point of view, he is claiming that America is not better than others, simply stronger than others. And in my view, this is a changing role of America. This is the end of American exceptionalism, and this end of American exceptionalism is declared not by others, by the United States and the American leader itself. Secondly, and this was also very clear, in my view, in the first statements after Trump was elected, his view on the alliance is totally different. It's not by accident that only 22% of the Europeans see the United States as an ally, because one of the major things that we can see as the Trump strategy is that he's trying to be so tough on the allies to scare the adversaries. So, and to be honest, this is a kind of a demonstration of power at a low cost. It's much easier to be tough on Denmark than on China. But this, of course, is putting Europe in a very particular position. And I do believe Europe is much more vulnerable for several reasons. Europe is not a nation state. And in a certain way, this kind of a transactional world is much more difficult for Europe than for any other power, because also you have the transactional world between the European nation states themselves. And as a result of it, Europe is in a kind of a situation of a maximal vulnerability. And many of the things that probably even the American president is hoping for are not going to happen. So as a result of it, it's much easier to be a peacemaker in the first day of your term. And it's much more difficult to sustain this position in 1 or 2 years, where basically most of these conflicts that we are facing are really not going to be easy to be resolved. And when what also Tim was pointing out, if you see the relations between China and Russia, for years we have been talking that it is much more the relations between their leaders. Yes, the Chinese and the Russian leaders are going closer together, but Russian society feels culturally, but even politically, far away from China. So we cannot talk about any type of a major alliance or leadership. And by the way, this kind of assumptions was very important for the first Trump presidency, who believes that he can separate and split Russia from China. Read the surveys, and this is not the case. So at the very moment where America basically is losing any type of interest in their allies, we see kind of the rise of different types of alliances, and alliances which are rooted in public sentiments and not simply in a leadership partnership. And my last point has to do is exactly again what Europe is doing in all this. When I was seeing the data, I have been reminded of a very important study that had been done in 1981, trying to see how different type of criminals are selecting their victims when they decide to attack somebody on the street. You know, this is a famous study in which they have been for 3 days with video basically filming people walking on the street, and then went to the inmates in one of the American prisons. And these people were basically arrested and imprisoned because they have been attacking people whom they don't know, and asked them to rank whom they're going to attack from 1 to 10. And it turned out that all of them are going to attack the same people. So in a certain way, in the moments like this, the most important is not to be a victim and behave like a victim, because if you're going to behave like a victim, you're going to be attacked. And from this point of view, in my view, this is also putting, in my view, a certain type of a light of a certain strategies that European leaders should choose. On one level, what the victims are doing, they're either pretending that they're very brave and heroic, going in the middle of the street in a bad neighborhoods and kind of walking like in an American Western movie, or on the other side, being kind of a totally scared and going in the middle of the road. So Europe is not going to be well advised, neither to stand heroic with respect to Trump, not basically to do what the American technological companies are doing, basically trying to please him to the extent that probably even for Trump it can go too much. I'm saying this because it's not going to be an easy position, and particularly in the early months of the Trump administration, because as we see, the world is ready to forgive Trump's many things, and Europe is not going to get any sympathy for being treated badly by the American administration. So any hope that you can have kind of an anti-Trumpian coalitions early in the American presidential administrations is totally unrealistic. So what Europe can do, and in my view, exactly this: not behave like a victim, not be heroic and not be submissive, and instead of opposing, try to confuse. And from this point of view, this kind of a new dynamics of European behavior are going to be critically important, because Europe is really vulnerable. It is Trump on one side trying to basically weaken Europe. Russia is going to do their best to weaken and to divide Europe. So for Europe, survival is going to be the major test. And I'm going to end up on this. When you read this data, you also understand something. the peak of the Trump's global influence is going to be on January 20. And with the passing of time and with adopting certain policies, he's going to have supporters, he's going to have kind of a new critics. But the early months of his administration are going to be really the peak of his influence. And in this period, for Europe, the most important is not to do anything stupid.
Very good. So our questions are already piling up in the box, and we'll come on to them in just a moment. But before we do, Mark, I can't resist putting Ivan's point to you about how Europe cannot act the victim, and what your sense is of the homework that we need to do to be able to build the sort of partnerships that Tim is talking about in terms of individual relationships to make us more resilient, what we need to do to be able to confuse beyond having sort of 27 member states and possibly more and a commission in order to confuse about our strategy. How do we do that while retaining the essence of the European project, the values in this transactional environment?
But it's extremely difficult because, I mean, our poll shows that there's quite a lot of disunity in European countries. One of our colleagues was talking to somebody in the Biden administration recently who is an intelligence officer, and they've been talking to the Trump transition team, and they were very surprised that the only questions about Europe that the Trump transition team wanted to have answers to is what political parties might support Donald Trump in different European countries. And it does seem like the main focus of the Trump administration, particularly in the early days, is going to be less on big geopolitical alignments and dealing with China and things like that, and more about domestic politics. I think many people in the Trump administration see European elites, particularly in the big member states, as supporters of Biden, and almost as a kind of continuation of the Biden world. And they're therefore trying to work out ways of weakening these different countries. And that's what you've seen with the interventions in British politics, in German politics, and it's deeply bewildering. People don't really know what to do. They don't want to rise to the bait. But if Donald Trump meets with Alice Weidel before he meets with Friedrich Merz when he's president, that will be incredibly difficult for the German political system to process, given that none of them will meet with Alice Weidel themselves and don't want to have anything to do with the AfD. So I think Ivan's right that we're swimming against the tide. It's going to be very, very difficult not to panic, not to do stupid things. There are going to be lots of governments that preemptively surrender and that rush to the White House and to Mar-a-Lago and other places to try and do deals. They will probably all be disappointed over time. That's what happened last time round. But they can do quite a lot of damage to European bargaining power in the short term. And it's a lot easier to say, just ignore all the stuff in the news cycle and get on with building long-term capacity so that we can be more resilient. Because, you know, if Trump says the things he's been saying about Greenland, it's pretty difficult for the Danish Prime Minister to get sucked into that. And if Elon Musk talks about overthrowing the British government, it's quite difficult for the British Prime Minister not to respond to that, and for that not to become part of the news cycle in different countries. But I do think the part of what you need to do if you don't want to be a victim is to think quite hard about what assets you do have are there, and work out what hostages you can take. If we're going to go into a transactional negotiation on trade, you don't want to be belligerent, but you do need to make it clear that there'll be consequences for American companies in Europe if things are done with. But it's going to be particularly hard because if tariffs are introduced, they're unlikely to be introduced against the whole EU. There will be differential tariffs going after certain products in certain countries, and that is going to lead to an even greater dynamic of fragmentation. So I think part of it is talking a lot amongst Europeans over time, it will be easier to get unity because more and more countries will have tried to suck up to Trump and won't have got very much out of it, and more countries will have particular problems. And obviously, the Ukrainian situation, which we haven't talked about yet, is very existential for a lot of different member states, and that's also going to create a huge dilemma for Europeans, because there's some countries that are going to want this war to carry on forever, and there are other countries that are very sympathetic to what Trump and his surrogates have been talking about, which is trying to end the war on terms which are, going to be very negative for Ukraine. So, from day one, we're going to have all sorts of different things coming at us from different angles: security, economics, political. And they're not going to be very coordinated on the American side. And it's going to be quite confusing for Europeans to sift through that and to stop panicking, because there's so many different things that could lead you to panic in different areas. But that is what we are going to need to do. So I think, have to try and create a lot of meetings amongst Europeans where we're trying to process these things together. We need to think about whether there are things that we can do to increase our leverage. And certainly on trade and in some other areas, the European Commission does have some tools which it can use, though they're sort of reluctant to use them, particularly after the experience with electronic vehicles in China, where you saw how divided Europeans actually are. That hasn't created greater confidence in Brussels about their ability to do things on behalf of the EU.
Great, thanks a lot, Mark. So I'm going to come now to pick up on some of the questions in the box, and I'm going to put them to you individually. But just one question that I think if any of you wants to come in on, or we can perhaps follow up with this person later that has been asked, is whether in view of Trump's macho man posture, as the question is put, are there any notable gender differences in the global survey data that you want to comment on? And I would just maybe add to that, if there's anything on sort of the demographics, whether we can see differences in the data that are striking. But I just put that out there in case any of you want to pick up on it in your other answers. Tim, can I maybe come back to you? And we have because I think that it would be great to hear you on this. We have a question in the box about how can Europe avoid its own inside transactionalism with defence and competitiveness as its priorities. And I think it would be good to hear your sense on this, since you sort of talked about the need to be transactional abroad, but less so at home. What can we practically do on that front, building on the sort of the difficulties that Mark has outlined? And maybe if we could get you to comment on Ukraine as well, how you think from this data we need to be handling this over the next period.
Sure, great. Well, extending Ivan's metaphor, I look forward to Europe putting on its black leather jacket and big boots to show it's not a victim. but seriously, I mean, just to add to what Mark said, we're going to be all over the place in the initial phase. That's absolutely clear. It's already clear. Interestingly, in a way, it's a case of the worse the better. If Trump is so contemptuous of Europe that he's slapping enormous tariffs on all of us and not discriminating, that will bring us together. In a way, the danger point is if they have a much more subtle and refined and divide and rule policy, advised as he will be by his favorite European leader, Viktor Orban, and as Mark was suggesting, differential tariffs. That's the point of maximum difficulty, I think. And this goes to your question, Susi. Very difficult. I think it's unlikely to happen. But the way it would have to happen would be for the leaders of the European institutions, and we have quite a strong commission under Ursula von der Leyen, together with a coalition of the willing of key European governments, obviously including Poland. I hope after Germany has formed a government, including a Friedrich Merz-led government in Germany, crucially, and some other countries, who make the case for 2 or 3 really big strategic European initiatives on plans developed by ECFR, of course. One of them clearly being defense, European defense, no-brainer. We have to go up to 3%. We have a defense commissioner who said we need 500 billion euros just for European air defense. How do we do that? A second one would be how we get the European economy going again. Mario Draghi has told us what it takes, 600 billion euros. Huge question to the frugal North European governments and crucially to Friedrich Merz. Is there any way in which you can support that? But that will be the second big one. And the third big one is Ukraine. Now, on Ukraine, what we know is the issue now in Ukraine is not, can it get back the whole territory in the frontiers of 1991? Frankly, that was the issue after 2014. If we'd reacted differently, it might have been possible. The issue is not even, alas, can we get back to the frontiers of the 23rd February 2022? Although, of course, Ukraine has every moral, legal, historical, political, and every other right to do so. But we could have been there if we'd had bolder, larger military support starting in 2022, but we're not. The issue is, can we guarantee such security for the 4/5 of Ukraine currently controlled by the Kiev government that the investment flows in because investors believe their investments will be secure, economic reconstruction takes place, Ukrainians return to the country instead of leaving it in large numbers, and you continue to have a pro-European, pro-reform government instead of what is otherwise going to happen, which is a chaotic, fragmented, conflicted Ukrainian politics with a very strong anti-Western and nationalist element, right? That's the issue. The only people, Susi, who can ensure that happens are the Europeans. The US is not going to do it. So what we know about Trump is, number one, he wants to get this issue off the table. He's made that very clear. Number two, he doesn't want to look like a loser. That's also very clear. And number three, he's not going to pay for it. And it's not going to be any American boots on the ground. So can we craft a European proposition about the nature of security guarantees and military commitments to Ukraine such that with US support and with the threat of the US big stick, we can make it work, and above all, we can also persuade ultimately by force and by deterrence Putin to accept it. So I think those are three big challenges for Europe, and if we manage to do those three, we'd be doing very well.
Thanks a lot. And before I let you off the hook, another question has come in while you were speaking about particularly how we get this approach right in terms of the balance between transactionalism and values, if you like, rule of law and human rights in relation to enlargement countries. Do you want to sort of comment briefly on that, or is that sort of a too big one to throw in at the end?
Well, sure. I think there are two issues. One is enlargement countries, and the other is all the other countries in the world, right? So, the EU has tended to want to have a whole package, the full Monty, as it were, of EU requirements, and to make linkages between them. In the case of enlargement countries, if we're serious about them becoming members, which in many cases we are not on both sides, but if we're serious about it, then we have to keep paying attention to the full package. By the way, that starts by the rule of law and democracy in EU member states, doesn't it? Yeah. Even before we get to enlargement countries. In the case of a country like India or China, or indeed Turkey, I think we need a certain paradigm shift. I think we need to keep talking about human rights and the rule of law and democracy and media freedom, but not necessarily to make progress on other areas like economy, energy, defense, environment and so on, dependent on those things. Do you see what I mean? So it's not that we become utterly craven and don't talk about these things at all. Yeah, we go on talking about them, but we don't let them stop us doing the deal on climate change or doing the deal on trade or doing the deal on security.
Thanks a lot. Okay, Ivan, I'm going to come back to you now. We've got quite a few questions that have come in on Trump's strategy. generally. So two in particular I wanted to highlight to you. Do you think that the EU should try to meet Trump's demands? And what do you think would be enough? There's a lot of talk about increasing defence spending and how much further we're going on this front. Is there ever going to be enough, or is that the wrong strategy? And then maybe a linked question: who do you see in the European landscape who could be the sort of Trump whisperer, Trump communicator in the European environment, given that von der Leyen is unlikely to be able to speak on behalf of all European states? And the questioner has noted that Merkel previously has played, with the previous Trump administration, played a certain role. Do you see people that have potential on that front? And also that could be doing this on behalf of Europe rather than their own country?
Let's make 4 points. And the first is we should start with the fact that it's not simply that the world is changing. The domestic politics of our countries is changing. And this is real. And in a certain way, most of this is not simply Trump related. There are certain issues with which Europe is not doing fine. America, the less of what you're going to say about it economically, at least for the moment, is doing fine. It's not true for Europe. Migration is a major issue. And obviously, we're seeing a major kind of a political change going on, and they're going to be, in my view, remaking the European political regimes also. And here's the major story. Europe is going to be wrong even if we're trying to keep certain type of a status quo on one level or not, because then the pressure from inside, with what is coming from Trump, and there's going to be pressure also coming from Russia, is going to be very difficult for the European Union and European democracies to survive. And I believe we should be clear on this, because Musk is doing regime change. And the difference, for example, with Bush and others is that he's doing the regime change in allied countries. So from this point of view, the domestic political stability within European countries means that there are going to be certain type of renegotiations with their own populations within Europe on the level of the political regimes. It's not going to be simply, we cannot expect that the fact that we are attacked by Trump or by Russia is going to be enough to consolidate. Secondly, Trump is going to be very fast, and in the next month or two, every 3 days, we're going to have new political initiatives and others. And Europe is very weak. In a certain way, Europe is weak because Europe is slow. And my major argument is going to do, we should weaponize our slowness. For example, Trump is going to push Europe. Trump is going to push Europe to decide on everything. On security, 5%, for example, GDP for defense, on the relations with the American technological companies and others. And in my view, Europe should basically be slow. We should not be fast to respond. We will not be fast to respond, basically coming with our own initiatives, which we believe we're going to make basically Trump happy. And we are not going to try basically to say, we can stay on our own, you're going to pay the cost, because the easiest way to expose your weakness is if you try to pretend that you're strong when you are not. And nevertheless, of what kind of initiatives we're going to take on the level of security, there is a time gap between everything that we're going to do and the real situation on the ground. By the way, one of the tragic facts is that after 30 years, 35, after the end of the Cold War, European security dependence on the US has been increased and not decreased. In a certain way, NATO was kind of a sleeping pill for European defense capabilities, and we are facing these realities. And from this point of view, in my view, also we should try to show to Trump that we're thinking about other things too. And here comes your question about the whisperers. Listen, the whisperers are going to whisper first in the interest of their own countries. I don't believe that they're going to be a whisperer with respect to Europe. Giorgia Meloni obviously is already whispering, but she's whispering basically saying what Italy can gain out of it. And the Orban case is even much more interesting. He's very supportive when it comes to regime change. But if you're carefully reading his, in my view, very important speech from July this last summer, you're going to see that basically he also, like the majority of people in the non-Western countries, see China and not the United States as the next hegemon. So from this point of view, one of the interesting story about Trump's policy is that he's trying to empower parties, some of them with quite strong anti-American sentiment, AfD included. This is not the pro-Americans that are now going with Trump. They're people who are trying to use Trump and Musk in order to get better position in their domestic politics. And on the other side, Trump and Musk are trying to use them in order to weaken European establishment, to have this or that. And for me, the most important is that we are seeing a wave. This wave is clear. You're going to see things that are happening simply because of the change, the mood of the people, the level of the people basically to accept certain things that otherwise they're not going to ready to accept. And from my point of view, we're not going to be in a good position trying first to guess what Trump is going to do, because Europe is not at the center of the Trump interest. If you really try to strategize what he was saying in the last 2 months most, he defined first the United States as a classical sea power. The most things that he's talking about is Greenland, Panama, basically the Navy roads, classical 19th century understanding of the world. And secondly, he's very much focusing on Americas. So from this point of view, the strategic marginalization of Europe in the mind of the Trump administration is real. It also has a cultural and other preconditions. The number of Americans with the European origins or related to Europe, or even visiting Europe recently, is very different than it was in 1950s, 60s, or 1970s. And my view is we're trying to basically see this reality, and we're trying to see that countries in Russia and China, who are much more behaving like a classical land powers, are going to put much more pressure in Europe and seeing Europe as much more important in their interest. But all this conversation is going to be possible only where on the level of the national democracies we manage to create a certain level of consensus about the world in which we are living. Because in my view, the biggest problem of Europe is that we are probably shocked, we are probably lonely, but we're still not ready to believe how dramatically the world has changed.
Thanks a lot, Ivan. Mark, I want to come to you with two questions which may be linked that we've had in the chat. One is around Europe and its ability to have a common approach to Russia in this environment. Do you see a possibility in view of Trump coming in that we will be able to sort of take tougher positions with regards to Russia, given the sort of the more threatening environment? Or conversely, do you see a likelihood of more division? And we have a question about whether we may see some European governments trying to align more closely, not only with Russia, but also with China in the current environment. And then also, if you could comment on a question which has come up about how and where we should be trying to coordinate as the EU with the UK, and where you see potential for alignment there.
Right. And there was also a question about gender and whether there were differences in gender.
Yeah.
So we didn't look closely at all the countries, but in the ones where you have huge majorities, like in India, not so much. In the very anti-Trump country, the capital of which I'm sitting in at the moment, London, is the most anti-Trump country in Europe. There you do have a sort of 15% gap between male and females, with the males being more Trumpian than the female respondents. On Russia, I think the Europeans have done a remarkable job of hanging together over the last few years, given the differences of history and geography and other kind of interests. And the US has been part of the cement and the glue which held Europeans together. So if you get a big shift in Washington, I think it will have a shift on some European attitudes, but it depends also a lot on what Putin does. I mean, he was the biggest cause of European unity over the last few years. If there is a peace deal, and there's a shift towards lifting sanctions and doing things like that, that will obviously shatter the consensus that you've had behind a lot of these different implements. And, you know, at the moment you have some member states that are looking at how do you make the sanctions even stronger on shadow fleets and looking at different ways of tightening things up, and other countries that are dreaming of moving to a more kind of normal situation. I think those sort of divisions will come out. But I think, you know, Ivan, I think be really interesting to hear what he says about what Putin's going to do after the election. It's not entirely clear to me that he's going to rush into a settlement, and I think that's going to have a very big impact on what Europeans do. What was the second question? Sorry, Susie.
About the UK.
Oh, the UK.
Well, yeah.
No, it's very striking to me that the UK has sort of traditionally been the country that wants to be a bridge, the country of the special relationship. But the poll here shows that actually the UK is really at the sort of extreme end of anti Trump sentiment in Europe, and there is going to be quite a tricky debate within the UK about the extent to which Britain is going to be able to get exemptions from tariffs and other elements and to try and go under the radar, or whether it should be using this moment to speed ahead with the reset. I think that British public opinion is pretty clear on where it stands. We did another survey at the end of last year, and people do feel much more closely aligned with the EU, not just on economic issues, but even on questions of war and peace. Interestingly, more people look to their European neighbours than the US for security now, which is quite a remarkable situation, and I think does show how nervous people are about Donald Trump. But so I hope that on both sides that this moment is one where people move forward more quickly. One of the really striking things about the US role in the world is its relative power has shrunk quite a lot in the world as a whole. But in terms of over the last 20 years or so, but in terms of the transatlantic relationship, the power differential between Europe and the US has gone in the opposite direction. The US and European economies were roughly the same size before Brexit. Well, if you go back 10, 15 years. And now the US is 50% larger than the EU. Some of that is to do with Brexit, because obviously a large chunk of the EU economy left. But a lot of it has got to do with differential growth rates and all sorts of other areas. But if you want a quick way of making Europe count more in the world, finding ways of aligning with the UK is the fastest way. It's going to be a lot faster than the Draghi plan in terms of increasing the reach of European regulation and European weight on different issues. And from the UK, there is a big danger that Britain gets squeezed between different jurisdictions in a more transactional world. You know, the hope is that you can be a flexible Singapore-like country that ducks and dives and finds great ways of having relationships with everybody. But the danger is that you end up on the wrong side of protectionism from all of the big economic blocks. And that is, I think, the dilemma which British policymakers are going to be facing over the next period of time.
Thanks a lot. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. I just want to close with one question to all of you, or to any of you that wants to answer it. We've talked about the weaponization, really, of everything. Confusion, slowness, surprise. But I wondered if, on that last note, any of you wanted to comment on what your senses of what we haven't foreseen that is going to impact this environment in Trump's first year. What do you feel that we haven't talked about that we ought to be thinking about?
I just want to make one point, and this is, we are seeing it everywhere. But there is a genuine fear of war, of a big war in the world. And probably this is one of the reasons basically why Trump was so much welcomed. And this kind of a catastrophic sense that something dramatic is changing because of economy because of these major conflicts which are going around and so on. This kind of a sensibility of population, in my view, should be taken very seriously. Because in a certain way, this was one of the reasons Trump is so well connected, but this is also going to be one of the reasons how people are going to support or distance from certain government policies.
Yeah, can I just add to that? There's a great Stanislav Let's aphorism. I thought we'd reached bottom, then I heard knocking from underneath. And I've thought of that many, many times over the last few years. But the important point is, it could get even worse. It could get even worse. There is no safety net. We're doing acrobatics on a high bar with no safety net. And people sense that, but our politicians and leaders are not talking about it. And so just to pick up on what Ivan said, what we need is for our leaders to acknowledge that, and then somehow to say we have a plan. Don't be scared, be prepared.
Thank you. Mark, do you want to take the mood up a bit at the end of the conversation, or?
Look, I think the one positive thing that we found at the end is that the rest of the world is a bit more optimistic about Europe's prospects than Europeans are, and I think that a lot of this, whether their optimism is right, will depend on the decisions which Europeans make in the next weeks and months ahead. I'm hoping that we will start with a period of maximum crisis and chaos and confusion, but that through that, Europeans are going to find a way to actually having more sensible policies and taking more responsibility in different areas. And actually, interestingly, a lot of things are now being talked about and were possible in different parts of the world because Trump has forced people to have different conversations. So I'm not sure that if you look at, we might have a deal in the Middle East in the next couple of days. It's not impossible to see in different areas that the sort of chaos and the disruption that Trump creates is forcing people to take more responsibility for different areas and to rely less on outside powers and to rely less on the US. And, the positive scenario would be if Europe is one of the inadvertent beneficiaries of Trumpian chaos, where Europeans are forced to do things that they should have done themselves a long time ago. But as you have heard from the discussion up till now, I think the jury's still out as to whether that will be the result of Donald Trump's re-election.
You two, all three of you, for a really fascinating conversation, and thank you to everybody that's been with us through the last hour. Colleagues have been sharing in the chat links to various pieces of writing that our three speakers have written over recent times, so you can follow up on those. But also let's keep the conversation going, and do feel free to be in touch with us at ECFR. We're interested to hear feedback and reactions to this report and others, and look forward to staying in touch. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye-bye.